thank you all for coming out this evening for what is going to be an awesome lecture. Tonight's lecture is part of the Exploring Economic Justice series, which is funded by the New Jersey Council for the Humanities, and is also co-sponsored by the Black Student Union. I'm so pleased to be with you tonight and to have a chance to introduce our guest speaker, Dorian Warren. Dorian Warren is an associate professor of political science and international and public affairs at Columbia University, and he's also a fellow of the Roosevelt Institute. Professor Warren specializes in the study of inequality and American politics. He teaches and conducts research on labor organizing and politics, race and ethnic politics, urban politics and policy, American political development, community organizing, and social movements. Prior to coming to Columbia, Professor Warren spent 2 years as a visiting scholar at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, and was also a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation. In addition to being a scholar of labor politics, Professor Warren is an activist and the host of Nerding Out on Shift by MSNBC, which is an online news program that explores political policies and strategies, and I encourage each and every one of you to check it out. It's pretty cool. He's a sought-after commentator who has made frequent appearances on networks such as MSNBC, ABC, CNN, NPR, and Bloomberg. Finally, Professor Warren is just a fascinating person, and we're all in for a treat this evening. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dorian Warren.
So thank you to Professor Brown-Glock for that very warm introduction, and welcome to all of you. And since it's a little embarrassing to talk about nerding out, but I'll give you a preview for tomorrow's show. Fashion Week is coming up in New York City next week. We're doing a Fashion Week preview where we're going to talk about the good, but especially the bad and the ugly of the fashion modeling industry. And I'm having a sociologist on to talk about her book, all about the fashion industry.
I'm gonna check it out.
So I also want to thank Professor Cisco for inviting me here and to be part of this series and all the co-sponsors. This is really an honor, and you have a great lineup of folks. You had a great lineup last semester, but you have a really fantastic lineup as well this semester. So thank you. My topic today is a little gloomy, but we'll try to keep it a bit fun and interactive. So I want to first say, if there are any questions you have along the way, feel free to interrupt me. If you don't understand something, just raise your hand and we'll tackle it. But I want to start, so the topic is inequality in the future of American democracy in the 21st century. But I want to start with 4 anniversaries and ask you a question. First, in the last 2 years, we've celebrated, we are celebrating, and actually I should add a 5th one here, a few significant anniversaries. So the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, we just celebrated the birthday of Martin Luther King Jr., and obviously we know about the I Have a Dream speech. By the way, you should read that speech in its entirety, because it's much more radical than what we like to think, especially the preamble and the beginning of that speech. The 1964 Civil Rights Act, which was a major piece of legislation ending discrimination by race and sex and public accommodations and especially employment. The 1964 Economic Opportunity Act. Anybody know what that is? Pop quiz. Guesses? In his State of the Union in 1964, President Lyndon Johnson announced a war on poverty. And that was the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act. And then, of course, 61 years ago now, was 1954 Brown v. Board of Education, Supreme Court decision, ending segregation in schools, although when we reflect on all of these significant victories, in fact, just last week there was an article in the Washington Post that shows how, for the first time in our history, the majority of students in American public schools are in poverty. So we have a long way to go, even as we mark these milestones. when it comes to issues of inequality and poverty. I'm going to show you lots of charts and lots of data. I'm going to try to overwhelm you with charts and data, actually, to drive home the narrative and the point. But we have a long way to go. But before I get to that, I want to ask you what the American dream is. What's the American dream? Well, what does it mean to you?
To be able to go to high school, go to American college, have a wife and kids, and be able to have a stable job and raise those kids.
Mm-hmm. Good. What else?
To me, the American dream is something that you have to be asleep to believe in.
You said you had to be asleep to believe in?
Yeah.
And what does that mean?
Because of inequality, which we're probably going to learn about. I don't think there is. Just you can just come to America and work hard, and then you're gonna have it made. I don't think it's like that.
For everybody?
No.
For some people, maybe?
For some people, maybe, but for most people, clearly, it's not working out too well.
Do you think that it used to be like that?
I think that's what's made out to be, that it used to be like that, but as far as my knowledge.
Very provocative. Okay, good. How about over here? What's the American dream?
I think it's to have the opportunity to have all the resources and opportunity to provide a lifestyle for yourself and efficient. Well,
So a couple words I heard you say are opportunity, resources, family. One of you guys? What's the American dream mean?
I think it just means to live comfortably and be happy.
Live comfortably. Do you think Americans are happy?
Generally, no.
Do you have any thoughts about why that might be the case? You seem happy, you're smiling.
I mean, I'm usually happy, but
Well, I'm going to make you not happy, but I'll try to make you happy by the end of the presentation.
So I read this article, Saving Horatio Algebra, Richard Reed from the Brookings Review, who traces this back a long time to the 19th century. And the way he frames it, as I recall, is sort of the belief in the possibility of upward social and economic mobility. That, to put a, definition on it, that people believe that their children will have a better life in America than they had, and their children will have a better life still. Each succeeding generation will enjoy a higher standard of living, greater opportunity, and greater prosperity. Not happening.
I did not pay you to say all of that, but you set me up very well for what I'm about to show you. We'll come back to this question at the very end. So let me show you quite a number of charts. So this is now 2 years old, but this was a study that found that 4 to 5 Americans faced either poverty, near poverty, or unemployment. Some kind of precariousness, some kind of lack of economic security. 4 to 5 Americans. So just think about this, 80% of Americans were facing near poverty, homelessness, unemployment, or some kind of economic insecurity, which was a striking finding to me. That this article didn't get a lot of attention, but it struck me as really significant. What we know as social scientists is that after the Great Recession, and actually leading up to the Great Recession of 2007, 2008, wages for the average American worker and the average American family have either been flat or have actually decreased. So what this chart is showing you is if you look at all of the recoveries from recessions since World War II, the growth in wages in those recoveries, and if you see 2009, our latest recovery from an economic crisis or an economic recession, it is the weakest post-war wage growth in terms of how much families are bringing home since World War II. This is showing you the wages workers have taken home over the last decade. So everyone but that 95th percentile, or the other way to see that is that's the top 5% up there, they're doing just fine. But everyone else, so the bottom 95%, according to this chart, since 2000, wages have essentially been flat when you take it all into account. I have a number of different ways I'm going to show you this. This is called labor share of income in terms of how much income at a corporation do the executives take home versus workers. We are now in a period where workers are taking home their lowest share of income from goods and services they provide at companies since World War II. Another way to look at this, I'm giving you different ways to look at this crisis of inequality, wage stagnation in particular. So this is showing you real median household income from 1989 to 2013. So over this time period, if you look, wages have essentially been flat. So even though there are racial differences, that's another type of inequality. So white families do better than Hispanic or black families, but for all three categories, they're basically making the same amount of money in 2013 as they were in 1989. Let me say that again. For most Americans, even across race, they are making the same amount of money in 2013 as they were in 1989. One of the consequences, this is an article from just a couple of days ago, and this thing keeps...
You should turn off your Wi-Fi.
I should turn off the Wi-Fi, exactly, okay. Let's see. Oh, let me do that so it stops interrupting. Thank you. Yay, okay. So this was just published in the New York Times a few days ago, but this shows you the shrinking American middle class. There's one punchline you take away. It's that the middle class has been shrinking and for quite some time. So if you look at that middle bar, this is from, is that 67, I believe it is? It's hard to read. From 1967 to 2013. In 1967, the middle class essentially made up 53% of all Americans. It has now shrunk to 43%. There has been an uptick in those in the upper income brackets. Slight uptick. But our vast middle class that made us a growing and strong democracy, especially in the post-World War II years, has been shrinking, especially over the last 40 years. Yes?
Is the middle-income families becoming upper-income families?
So that's a really good question, which I don't have the full answer to. Yes, some are, but there's other data to suggest that's probably not the case, that there's probably something else going on. So let's come back to that question at the end, because I want to show you some other measures around upward mobility that suggest it's not necessarily shrinking middle class because they're becoming upper class. I like to show this because this shows you unemployment rates of blacks and whites from the early 70s to 2011. And what I like to show is that at the point of the lowest level of black unemployment, it actually never reaches the highest level of white unemployment over this entire time. So black unemployment is almost always double white unemployment. And if you look, basically these 2 points, so the highest level of white unemployment basically matches the lowest level of black unemployment. So, interesting thing, we might want to ask the question, what's happening in the American labor market, where we have such persistent levels of, especially black unemployment. Now this is an interesting slide, and I want you to pay attention to the left-hand side first. This shows you from 1948 to 2013, 2 things. One is worker productivity, so how productive are workers at the job, on the job. And second, their hourly compensation. And from roughly the end of World War II to about 1973, as workers were more productive, their wages went up as well. So there's a very tight relationship between worker productivity and wage growth. Are you more productive as a worker? You actually get a raise. Hey, that's a good idea. And then something happens where that relationship, that very close relationship, begins to break apart. And even though American workers have continued to be more and more and more productive over the last 50, 60 years, starting in the 70s, their wages stopped keeping up with productivity. And so you might be wanting to ask yourself, well, why would that be the case? What explains this relationship here? And then what explains this gulf? How do we account for that? Okay, a couple of more inequalities. Oh, yeah, please.
Wage theft.
Wage theft. And what is wage theft?
Well, it's when the managers cheat the workers out of the wages that they're rightfully entitled to and take it for themselves as profit.
Everybody hear that? Okay, just remember that. Remember exactly. And sir, what's your name?
Mort Winston.
Mr. Winston?
Yeah, right.
So remember what Mr. Winston just said, because I will show you some data on wage theft in a little bit. So that's one plausible explanation.
You're
Absolutely.
actually working as a...
Well, I actually did pay him. I really did pay him. So a couple graphs, maybe you've seen some of these, maybe you haven't. This is the 1%. And social scientists, I have to say, we're talking about the 1% and the top 1% for at least a decade before it became popular with Occupy Wall Street in 2011. But this is showing you the 1% share of income from 1913. And in this case, this chart stops at 2009. But notice just the shape of this. So you have this peak where the top 1% took home almost a quarter of national income in 1928. Then you have this interesting U where it goes back up. And if you notice what's significant about those 2 years, 1928, 2007. Yep.
Right before an economic collapse.
Right before an economic collapse. Coincidence? Correlation? No relationship?
Oh, no, there's a relationship. I said there's a relationship.
And what do you think it is? Don't worry, I don't get to grade you, so you can say.
I'm not sure.
All right, I'll give you some help. I'll give you some help. But just notice the U shape, because I want to come back to that, and notice what, again, the point you just made, right? So the 1% taking home an incredible amount of money relative to the rest of the country right before economic collapses. This is the U.S. in comparative perspective. So we are the red line here. And if you see, most of these countries, the US, Japan, the UK, France, and Canada, had high levels of inequality at the beginning of the 20th century. Something happens in the middle of the century, there's that U shape, and the US, though, is leading the drive towards inequality in this case. So this is the top, not the top 1%, the top 10th of 1% in terms of how much they take home relative to everybody else. This is different data, but showing you a similar pattern. So this is from 1979. The average household income of the top 1% relative to everybody else. So if you just notice the flat lines for most Americans in terms of household income relative to the top 1%, we're doing very well. Good for them. Don't we all aspire to be in the top 1%? Well, something at least. Since I live in New York City, I'd like to point out that overall in the US by 2010, 2011, the top 1% was taking home, the top 1% was taking roughly 20% here. You see this? But if you live in New York City, the top 1% in New York City took home 38.6% of the income, the total income in the city. Very unequal place. The first decade of the 2000s, everybody lost money, on average, even across racial groups. So this is US income, this is median household income for the first decade. All families fell in the first decade of the 21st century. And I try to bring some fun graphics sometimes. I crib from Mother Jones and other places. So this is showing you for the first time in a century, the top 10% of Americans control more than half of all income in the country. And so there we are right now. That's the trajectory in terms of a small percentage of people that have concentrated income and wealth, I should add. If you look at the recovery, so this is showing you the top 1% has captured almost all post-recession income growth. So of all the income growth since the recovery, and I'll put recovery in quotation marks, since the recovery, so the Obama recovery you see down here, the top 1% has captured 95% of all the income growth. And that's related to the other recoveries from the 20s, the Clinton years, the Bush years. So the top 1% is doing fine, and I'm not saying this to vilify the top 1%. This is just data. It's just the data. Here's another interesting graphic. So the amount of total income controlled by the top 1%, and this is historical estimates, how exactly they got the data from ancient Rome, I don't know. But the top 1%, ancient Rome, 16%, even the America, 1774, 7%. Look at America before the Civil War, 10%. 1929, 1960, and then America 2012. So we were actually, in some ways, in terms of income and wealth, more equal at our founding. There is this little thing called slavery, of course. I don't know how that figures into numbers, but you get the picture, right? That we are growing unequal. We've been growing unequal for the last 40 years when it comes to income and wealth in this country. I just want to point out, because this was an Oxfam study released last week, when we think about global economic inequality, maybe some of you heard this, but the richest 80 people in the world now have the exact same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% of all people in the world, which is 3.5 billion people. So let me say that again. The richest 80 people in the world now have as much wealth as the bottom half of the entire global population, which is 3.5 billion people. Or to put it a different way, this is the number of billionaires it takes to have accumulated the same amount of wealth as the bottom 50% of the global population. Just in 2010, it took 388 billionaires, now it only takes 80. So even among we could say the top 10% in the world, wealth is becoming more and more concentrated. And this raises questions for you about opportunity, about mobility, about democracy that I want to come back to. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead here. I want to point out that we are world leaders in lots of things, those of us here in the US of A. One of them is child poverty. Roughly 1 in 4 kids in America lives in poverty relative to other democracies and our peers. We're doing worse on this measure. Actually, when you look at this by race and age, it gets a little more depressing. So if you look at kids under 6, so about 14% of white kids under 6 live in poverty, 42% of black kids, 1 in 3 Hispanic kids live in poverty in America today. Now, what are the implications of this? So I've been trying to paint you a picture a little bit about income inequality, wealth inequality. What are the implications? So somebody mentioned the American dream involves upward mobility, which is true. That is our notion of upward mobility and what the American dream means. There's a certain way social scientists try to measure upward mobility in a society. So the way we do that is we take, say, your parents at a certain point in time, maybe it's 1980, we see what their household income is, and then 30 years later we come and measure you, their kids, and see what your income is. And the question is, are you in the exact same income bracket as your parents were? So if you were born poor, are you poor when you're an adult? If you're born rich, are you rich as an adult? If you're born middle class, are you middle class? Do you get the idea? So the way we measure this is something, there are lots of terms, intergenerational correlations. All you need to know is that it's an indicator from 0 to 1. The lower the number, the more mobility you have, social mobility you have in a place. The closer you are to 1, or the higher the number, less mobility you have. The harder it is, say, if you're poor, to make it into the middle class or to become rich. Everybody got that? So this is us compared to other countries. The UK and the US have become less mobile countries. relative to all these other European countries plus Canada. We tend to think of European countries as being less upwardly mobile than the US, but the data don't bear that out, it turns out. Here's another look at this. So this is just taking sons. So we look at sons born to a low-income father and see if they made it out of that income bracket, see if they made it from being poor to, say, middle class or upper class. So if you look at the left-hand bars, so this is low-income son, low-income father, and the son is in the bottom 40%, versus a low-income father, and the son makes it to the top 40%. You see this is almost at 1. And again, relative to other countries, we're a less mobile place than in other societies. Or, if you don't believe the international comparisons, this is the same kind of data but over time in the US. So this starts in 1950, and this only goes up to 2000. We were actually becoming a more mobile society as we even got to 1980. So as that number went down, we were becoming more mobile. And then something happened, and we've become a much less mobile society. So you said something like, if you believe in the American dream, you must be asleep.
Yeah.
Well, you have some data on your side, unfortunately. It's not a happy thing for me to say. But we've become a much less mobile society. And let me just make one conceptual clarification about this. When we talk about social mobility, we don't just mean upward mobility. Social mobility means people can make it up, but it also means people fall. So yeah, it's great. If you're born poor and you become middle class, that's upward mobility. That's great. If you're born rich, the question is, do you stay rich or maybe you fall into the middle class? Or maybe you become working class. But mobility implies both directions. And so this is telling you, it's telling us that mobility is becoming less, meaning people born rich are staying rich and people born poor are staying poor in America today. Questions about any of that? Let me give you the implications of inequality. So this is, let me emphasize just correlations, but I think it's provocative. So this is a measure of income inequality mapped on, graphed on an index of all those things: life expectancy, math and literacy rates, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, imprisonment, teenage births. What is that? Trust, obesity, mental illness, and social mobility. And the graph is showing, and making an argument here, this is from a book by public health researchers in 2009, that the higher levels of income inequality, the worse a country does in all those indicators. So the higher income inequality you have, the higher rates of infant mortality, the lower rates of math literacy, higher rates of teenage births, lower rates of trust, higher rates of homicide. So you get the picture. There are broad societal implications for inequality. And now we have researchers who are coming out and saying, if you care even about economic growth, if you want to grow the economy, higher levels of inequality actually inhibit growth. More equal countries are growing faster than the US when it comes to the economy. Okay, so I just tried to paint you a picture of at least some trends, at least in terms of income inequality, and the growing divide, frankly, between the rich. It's not even the rich and poor, it's the rich and everybody else. So the question is, what explains growing inequality? You said wage theft. Any other guesses?
That's only part of the answer.
That's part of the answer. Any guesses? Because part of, hopefully, what I showed you is it didn't used to be like that. That there was a period when the country grew much more equally and income and wealth was distributed more equally. So it didn't always used to be like that. Any explanations? Thoughts, guesses?
Globalization.
Globalization.
Corporations also.
So globalization in terms of, especially manufacturing jobs, let's say, and trade, increased trade integration means a lot of our jobs, say in the steel industry or auto industry, though we still have auto, but steel, some other in textiles, went abroad because trading was made easier. Those used to be middle class jobs, and therefore the jobs that replaced them have been not as good jobs, which has led to. So globalization is one answer.
Monopolies, like corporations being control everything. You can have mom and pop shops anymore.
So let's call that the Walmart effect.
Walmart. Still work for Walmart.
So Walmart, for those of you that don't know, is the country's largest employer. It is one of the, I think it was the richest corporation in terms of profits last year. It always competes with ExxonMobil or one of the oil companies. And if you stacked every 4,000 Walmart store on top of itself, you could actually be the only visible structure from the moon on Earth. I'm fascinated with Walmart. I'm obsessed with Walmart. Walmart is also not only the largest toy retailer, it's the largest gun retailer in the country.
No,
Go on.
that's health insurance.
And did you have health insurance or not?
No.
Oh, and why didn't you have health insurance?
Because to get health insurance, were required to stay, I think, 90 days, and you had to work over 40 hours, but we weren't allowed to work 40 hours.
You weren't. What do you mean you weren't allowed to work 40 hours?
Basically, our manager said you can't work 40 hours.
So how many hours do they schedule you for a week?
Usually to the minimum, because I'm still going to school, they maxed me from like 35, but other people were going 39, 38. but
So they take you to
couldn't
38,
max.
39, but not 40.
Yeah.
I'm grilling you because this is a point of them.
It's okay, I paid them all.
Any other guesses? Growing inequality? Yes, Professor?
Weakening of labor unions.
I mean, well, I'm clearly paying him. I'm going to get to that. Anything else? Any other guesses? Labor unions?
Tax rates on the percentile.
You say tax rates?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, I owe you a 5. I'm clearly paying you as well. Okay, you guys are too good. All right, so part of the explanation is education and human capital. These are often the arguments we hear. And something called skill-biased technological change. So the changing nature of jobs in the economy require higher levels of skills. And so often this is also referred to as a skills mismatch, that we're not preparing you, our young people, for the jobs of the future. And so that leads to inequality. I'm going to come back to that point. Obviously, globalization is the second explanation, and structural transformation of the economy. And as we said earlier, this argument is that as we've increased our trade, especially with more developing countries, we've exported lots of good-paying middle-class jobs, but we haven't replaced them with the same kind of jobs over the last 30 years. Some would argue it's changing social norms, that, hey, it's okay if CEO pay is 400 times what the average worker makes, even though maybe only used to be 50. But we're okay with that because we all think we're going to be the CEO one day. So our norms have changed around our tolerance for inequality. And I think all of those are good explanations, but they tend to lack agency to an extent of human beings. And for me as a political scientist, I think a lot of the explanation is politics. And so I'm going to try to give you a sense of this, but first I want to argue that part of the reason why we see rising inequality is the changing nature of jobs and work. And that is also a political question, though, let me hasten to say. So this is the share of employees in low-wage work. This is actually old data, so this is from 2009. So roughly 1 in 4 American workers was in a job defined as low wage. So that's roughly, at the time, probably $10 or less. Who knows what the minimum wage is right now?
$8.25.
In New Jersey or in the?
Yeah, New Jersey.
Excellent. Federally, it's $7.25. Okay, we'll come back to that. So this is the share of workers earning poverty-level wages, broken down by race and ethnicity. So 43% of Hispanic workers in 2011 were in jobs earning poverty-level wages, a third of black workers, and a quarter of white workers. Meaning, for workers that worked full-time, if you got 40 hours a week, based on the official government poverty rate, you would still be living in poverty.
Question.
Yes?
Does that also include under the table work?
No.
Okay.
But most under-the-table work, most work in the underground economy, I would argue, with some exceptions, but you're still living in poverty as well. Yeah?
Could you remind us all what the official unemployment, rather what the official poverty rate is in the United States?
It is roughly, I think it's $15,080. I have a chart that has it on there coming up. But I think it's $15,080. Overall, the poverty rate's about 15%. Yeah,
How much money do you have to make to be in the top 10%?
be in the top 10%.
Yes.
It's roughly 150,000. No, it might be less than that. It might be about
I think it's about 100,000.
About 100, yeah, that's a good round number. Let's say it's about 100,000. So 90% of Americans don't make $100,000 a year. But to be in the top 1%, any guesses?
788,000.
It's a little less than that, I think.
Are you sure?
No, you see, all right, we'll Google this later. But that gives you, but yeah, in terms of top 10%, it's about $100,000. All right, so just while I'm still on jobs, so this on the left-hand side, it shows you the nature of jobs, low, mid, or high-wage jobs lost in the recession, the Great Recession of 07, 08. And on the right-hand side, it's showing you the number of jobs, or rather, the number and the type of jobs gained in the recovery. So essentially, we keep losing middle-class jobs, and the jobs we're creating are low-wage jobs. Why is this important? It's because people often say, well, one of the solutions is more education. Hey, that's why we're all here, right? You need your education, for sure. And it is correlated to higher wages, to a better career in life, without question. But I want to problematize that solution with this chart. So every year, the Department of Labor puts out a projection. These are occupations with the largest numeric growth projected to 2020. So these are the largest growing occupations in America, projected out to 2020. These are the jobs of the future. 16 of the 20 jobs only require a high school diploma or less. 16 of the fastest growing jobs in America require a high school diploma or less. So that means there's a mismatch between what we're telling people in terms of the jobs of the future and the education required versus the reality. So here it is in pictorial form. So again, these are projected job growth. Yes, for people with bachelor's degrees, yay, there are going to be lots of jobs. And even if you have a master's or doctoral degree, there'll be some jobs created. But the fastest and largest growing jobs, the vast overwhelming number of jobs we're creating are low-wage jobs in this country. Or to put it a different way. In 2009, 1 out of 4 jobs in the economy was a low-wage job. By 2020, more than almost half of our jobs in the economy would be low-wage jobs. Questions on that? Depressed? Okay, let me keep going.
Money back.
There's also another problem in terms of our economy and work, and that's something we call the rise of involuntary part-time work. Now, we're just talking about this. There are people that want to work full-time, 40 hours a week, but their employers won't let them. For a number of reasons. One big one is benefits. Hey, if you work 40 hours a week, an employer has to provide a certain amount of benefits. In some cases, it's 30. So what our employers do to get around that, because benefits cost money, they'll assign you for 39 hours a week or 28 hours a week. And so we've seen, especially with the onset of the Great Recession, but the pattern is still way too high in terms of people that want to work full-time but can't. And if that didn't frighten you, how about this? Something called technology and automation. Now, we've been having an argument about automation since the 50s and 60s. Some would argue that this time is different, that technological advances are speeding up every year. And so by one study, this is an Oxford study that came out in 2013, which estimated that of all current jobs in the American economy, 47% could be robotized. You catch that? 47% could be robotized. So if 47% of jobs can be done by a robot, what are you going to do? There's a question? Okay, I'll keep going.
It's a robot repair.
But I know, I keep saying that. Somebody has to fix the damn robots when they break. That's a stable future.
Or we can become like the Terminator.
Or
Robot manufacturing.
robot manufacturing, and you've been hearing a lot of, right, 3D printing, there's the Google automated, car, auto-driving car, there's a lot of stuff happening through technology. I'm not trying to scare you too much, but there are arguments being made, and we should take them seriously
Isn't that also happening?
about changes in the economy, and especially with technology.
Isn't that also happening? I mean, from what I heard, is happening with McDonald's, like they don't want to raise the minimum wage, so instead they're just getting machines to do the work.
For some of it, now they can't get machines to do all the work, but sure, you can imagine. And so that's an argument McDonald's makes to their workers, and they basically say, stop asking for higher wages because that's just the faster we're going to replace you with a robot, right? So, they could have, it's almost like there's the, self-checkout in lots of stores, right? Well, those used to be human beings, there used to be clerks that did that. There used to be baggers that would bag your groceries. We haven't had that in a long time. So there's some level of technological change that always happens. The argument people are making now is that this time is different because advances in computing are happening so rapidly that we're in danger of losing a lot of what we consider jobs, traditional jobs. Yeah?
So I've been Googling, you're right.
I knew you would.
Yeah, the IRS 2010-2014 database, top 10% is 380,000, top 5% is 159,000, top 10 is 113,000.
So 113,000. And what was the top one?
380.
380. So to make it to top 1%, 380. To make it top 10, 113. Okay, let me quickly go through these. So if I can scare you with robots, we can come back to that. I'm obsessed with Walmart and robots, if you must know. So there's an issue of low-wage jobs. There's also an issue of the quality of jobs. We're the only industrialized country that does not mandate paid holidays or paid vacation. We're the only rich democracy that does not mandate paid holidays or paid vacation. Now, some employers are kind enough to give them to us, but we don't mandate it under federal law, like almost every other place in the world. And then here's the chart that was just for you. Wage theft.
Oh, good.
2012, this is just the amount of, so wage theft, right? When a worker works their hours and employer doesn't pay them, that's called wage theft. This is a growing epidemic, especially for low-wage workers, especially for immigrant workers. And you can see the cost, and this is just in 2012, of the amount of money recovered. So basically $1 billion in wages stolen from workers that was recovered by the Department of Labor. So that's just the tip of the iceberg of what's happening. So we're creating low-wage jobs, and even people that are in those jobs, they're not even earning all that they should be earning. And this is really problematic if you work in the restaurant industry and you work for any tipped job. Tips are a place of very high violations of the minimum wage. So just keep that in mind for those of you that are a waiter or waitress.
How is this happening? Like the tips, that's one example. I don't understand how that much money can just not be given or received out.
Okay, let's say you have a job and you work 40 hours a week and your employer says, I'm only going to pay you for 35. What do you do?
Can I have my money, please?
And then they say you're fired. Then what are you going to do? Because it's not legal to fire you for that.
I'm in trouble, I guess.
I can fire you based on your sex. I mean, I can't fire you based on your sex or your race or your religion, but if you talk to me like that, I can fire you for that. You're being insubordinate. And frankly, I will make an example of you to everybody else in the room so that when I spill their wages, they won't ask me the same obnoxious question. That's how it happens. Often. Yeah.
You can't sue them? You worked for the hours, why can't you file a lawsuit?
Oh, well, workers do, and then that's how they get their money recovered.
So that's it.
Yeah, but there's a very small percentage of workers who feel empowered to file a lawsuit, number one. This process to recover lost wages takes at least 3 or 4 years. It takes a long time. We don't have enough enforcement of our existing labor market standards. So it actually creates this kind of perverse incentive where employers can do this and get away with it. It's actually more pernicious in places where there are undocumented immigrants, because even though they're actually protected by labor law, there's a fear that if they come forward, they'll be reported to the authorities and deported. So in industries that rely on especially immigrant labor, this is rampant. So think people that pick your tomatoes. Almost 99% immigrant, almost 99% undocumented immigrant workers who pick our tomatoes. This is rampant because there is a fear of coming forward about these really what are now normal violations in non-labor industries.
My mom, she got fired for that. Yeah, she used to work at Wood & Taylor, and because we didn't have money to get like clothes or stuff, she used to get them from the trash, which is by Lord Taylor and her. I've read all the legal documents from her. That is public property. She got fired for that, and my brother.
So really, what are we doing on time? 5 minutes. Okay, I have to rush through this. Okay, because I have to get to the union stuff. I just want to always remind people that we lock up more people in this country than the top, what does that say, 35 European countries combined. In case you're wondering. Or that's a map of how we lock people up in the world. We like locking people up. We don't like giving them jobs, or decent jobs. We like locking people up. Okay, you mentioned tax policy back there. So yes, tax rates have come down. I'm just going through these really quickly. So if you're in the top 1%, your top tax rate has come down significantly over the last, especially 20 years. We're having a debate about that now in Congress and with the president. Something called deregulation I'm skipping over. I want to show you this. The decline of the labor movement, the decline of unions is a big part of the explanation. In the mid-50s, about 1 in 3 workers was a member of a union. Now it's in the private sector less than 6%, so from a high of about 33%, 35% to now less than 6%. I just also want to point out this shape is the inverse of a U. Remember I was showing you the U shape earlier in terms of income inequality? That's kind of the flip side of it. So here's some other suggestive data. This is a union membership rate with the middle class share of national income. So as the union membership rate has gone down, the middle class has been taking home less money. This is, of course, a correlation, not a cause, but still suggestive. So this gives you the two shapes, actually, together. So this is union membership over the 20th century, and this is share of income going to the top 10% over the 20th century. You can see there's some kind of relationship here between the strength of, and unions, you might argue, are a proxy for worker power on the job. So as workers have more power on the job, they got to take home more money, some benefits as well. And as workers have lost power on the job, they take home less money. It's actually not a very complicated story. I'm going to skip through a couple other things. Okay, so somebody asked about the poverty question. So here we go. Sorry, I was wrong. The poverty line for a family of 2 is $16,078 a year. But if you work at the current federal minimum wage, 40 hours a week, 60 weeks a year, you only make $15,000 and $80. $15 and $80. So you could work full-time at minimum wage, but you don't even make it to the federal poverty line for 2 people, much less for a family of 3 or 4. In 1968, a family who worked the minimum wage in today's dollars made $19,000 and change. But today it's only $15,000. And this is a hopefulness here, that if we were to increase the minimum wage, maybe we could get people back up above the poverty line. This is showing you the ratio of CEO pay to typical workers' wages. As of 2012, it's about 273 to 1. But as you can see, that's a recent phenomenon. It's very recent. 70s, 80s. It wasn't until the 90s, really, in the 2000s, that CEO pay took off. So recent phenomenon. A few more slides. I find this really interesting. This brings us back to the American dream. So this is a question that is about optimism of the next generation. And this is in what the Pew Research Center calls advanced economies. What they mean is rich democracies like the US. So they ask the question, when children in our country today grow up, will they be worse off or better off financially than their parents? And for people in advanced countries like the US, more people are saying worse off than better off. Versus, say, those in developing countries or what are called emerging markets, a bit more optimism in both emerging countries and developing countries. More optimism, but in rich countries, so think the US and Western Europe, people are very pessimistic. Whether you call it the American dream, whether you call it opportunity, whether you call it mobility, there's pessimism that's matching the data we're seeing. And I'm only showing you data from the labor market, from the economy. Okay, but there's hope. More people are Googling income inequality, so at least that's a good thing. People won't know about it. Then there's this guy. Who knows who this guy is? And Nick, you're not allowed to answer. You might know this guy? Okay, Nick, tell us. Professor.
That's Piketty, the man who just wrote a book called Capital. He's just been getting a lot of attention recently.
One of the most highest selling books in 2014. He's a French economist. And as Nick said, he wrote this book called Capital. By the way, all that data that I was showing you, most of it is from him. Especially the data that looks at tax returns from 1913 when we first instituted a federal tax. He's the one with a colleague of his at Berkeley who collected the data that we all use now to understand these patterns. So, you know, this is at least being discussed. The president is discussing it. Even members of Congress in both parties are discussing it. And I emphasize both parties are talking about poverty and inequality. It's kind of surprising. So there, you know, there's a big question here. There is a rise of a new global elite that we're all calling the 1%. Some people have called the broader patterns the Great Divergence. I like this New Yorker cover because this was like the week after Occupy Wall Street emerged in 2011. Maybe a couple weeks after Occupy Wall Street, and we have some 1%ers who are also protesting, as you can see. I'm skipping that. And I want to come to these last two slides. So, who can define what an oligarchy is? What's an oligarchy?
A society run by the rich.
Yeah, and
Well,
since you know,
ruled by the few.
ruled by the few, and usually the powerful few, and usually that has meant wealth. So yeah, it's ruled by the few technically, right? And what's democracy? Ruled by the many, by the people. So I just like listing, you know, what are some of the elements of democracy that we think of? Participation, voting, inclusion, fundamental rights, freedom of expression. But then we also live in a country right now. I mean, if you look at our political system, we have two brothers who basically said they're going to spend $1 billion, $889 million, in the 2016 election. Do you have $1 billion to spend? Because I don't. Do you think their $1 billion matters more than my vote or your vote? That's the question. And so, oligarchy, actually it's a really fun book, if you're interested, compared to democracy. We used to think that these two things weren't compatible, that an oligarchy cannot coexist with a democracy. You can't have ruled by the few and ruled by the many at the same time. And some of us are starting to question that relationship. Because at least the modern United States, and especially our political system, is starting to look more like an oligarchy than a democracy. And we have several studies in political science in the last 3 years that have come out that show the wealthy and the most affluent, when it comes to their political preferences on policy issues, almost always win out and get their way over the vast majority of Americans who might have different views on a policy issue. We know about the role of money in politics. So I want to raise this as a question mark. Obviously, it It's not an exclamation point yet, depending on what we do about it, but it's a question mark. Are we becoming a country where there's less mobility, less opportunity, and it's ruled by the few? Or what does it mean to really have a country that is both a democracy and has some element of economic justice? And so I'll leave you with, I just kind of like the Charlie Brown. Maybe most of you are too young to like Charlie Brown, but you know, every Christmas, a Charlie Brown Christmas comes on, and Halloween. Anyway, there are people, there are fast food workers, there are Walmart workers who are trying to organize and change things. And so I'll leave you with these two questions and just open it up. I found it way too long, but I mean, there is a question if the American dream is still alive. And I think there's a second question, especially for you, is based on where, at least the trends of the data I showed you, what kind of world would you want to see in 15 years? And what will we need to do to realize that world instead of the world that we're currently in?
Sure, we have time for 15 minutes of questions.
Nice meeting you.
Nice meeting you. Thanks for playing. Your check is in the mail.
I wish.
Questions, thoughts, counter arguments?
You know, your first question, your first question is the American dream still alive is an interesting question and a complicated question, as you know, because, and I think someone touched on it before, that the dream really applied to a select few, right? And so it depends on which group benefited in the past from that dream. I think that group has gotten smaller today, but they may still believe that it is still attainable. But for other groups who historically have been excluded from that dream, would probably say, well, it is what it is. It was never ours in the first place, so nothing has changed. And so that's a really interesting question, you know. I don't think it's a yes or no question. It's really
And you just made me think, because this is it is a puzzle in the sense that I started with those anniversaries. So if we take, say, 1965, we're going to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Voting Rights Act. And if you think of that as the first moment where we had true inclusive democracy in this country, where for the first time actually everybody under the law had the right to vote, the expectation, so we had greater inclusion, and indeed, especially black voters in the South, registered in large numbers. Citizens across the country, in the 70s, we expanded the vote even more to 18-year-olds. So we're expanding our democracy, we're making it more inclusive, especially for formerly disenfranchised black voters. They elected black city council members, mayors, and then ultimately a president. So this is a democracy that's been expanding on the one hand, at the same time as economic opportunity has been increasing. And that's the puzzle for a lot of us, is how do we make sense of the expansion of democracy over the last 40 years, 50 years, with the contraction of economic opportunity. Yeah.
So if like the powerless keep getting wronged, like the example with the wage theft, and there's nothing you can do about it, it sounds like there really is like there's no escape, and they have so much power that honestly, like I'm thinking throughout this that we're trending towards like the Hunger Games dystopian kind of proletariat.
That's why Hunger Games is so it resonates.
Yeah, but I mean that's honestly what like is there any escape? I mean this is the way that things are trending. I just don't see us going in a positive direction ever.
Come on, our resident comparative historical scholar.
I mean, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I'm thinking about, I mean, in terms of a more maybe a direct way of addressing what you say we're trying to figure out.
Yeah.
I mean, it does seem like there is something distinct about the structure of the American state that has to do with this. Both in terms of federalism, and in terms of the ways in which public order is maintained in this country. So I would say I would gravitate toward an explanation having to do with that. The other thing I want to mention is that you're using Western Europe as a point of comparison. It's worth pointing out that, and I don't need to add to the gloom, but in the last 5 years or so, an awful lot of the gains that had been made in Western Europe in terms of not just economic growth, but relatively equitable economic growth. I mean, those gains had already begun to decline a bit by the time the crisis hit. But now, in the last 5 years, Europe has been in a recessionary spiral that shows no signs of letting up. And we see how this has been made manifest in a country that does not have the United States' methods of public order. In Greece, where you now have political extremism. And now Greece is sort of swinging from the rafters, trying to solve its problems when it has very little capacity to impact its environment. The United States has enormous capacity, not unlimited, but relatively much bigger capacity to impact its environment.
Okay, I was aiming for you to be hopeful, so so let me just say that, I mean, we've been here before. We've been here before, and many times before. And so the most recent example would be the Great Depression. The last time we had this level of inequality, that was the end of what we call the first Gilded Age. And arguably we're in the second Gilded Age right now. But what did we do? What happened to get us to grow the middle class from roughly 1945 to 1973? To provide more ladders of opportunity from that period, for those 30 years? Well, there was regulations of certain kinds, there was changes in tax policy, there were investments in infrastructure, I mean, there were a range of things. There was also a growing labor movement in the 30s. And I want to emphasize this point around low-wage jobs, because by the time we get to 1955, where 1 in 3 workers are members of the union, the American economy is growing at significant rates. After World War II, the middle class is broadly expanding. Those middle class jobs weren't born middle class, they were made middle class. By a growing labor movement, by workers taking action and saying, no, this is unacceptable. And whether it's wage theft or whatever it is, this is unacceptable, and there have to be some fair rules at the workplace. And there has to be some shared prosperity. We will be productive, we will make profits, but we want to share in those profits. And so that's something I've researched and I'm an expert in, but it's not the only answer, but that's part of the answer. There are lots of things we did in terms of politics, in terms of policy, in terms of people trying to change their employers to actually be better. And we have, in some ways, the dual crisis at the very least. We have an environmental crisis. And we have to figure out how to change corporate behavior and the behavior of governments. As well as, I would argue, a huge problem in crisis of work, both in terms of low-wage work. We can make those low-wage jobs, by the way, good jobs. They're not predestined to stay low-wage jobs. Steel, auto, when those jobs first came about, they were really crappy, poverty-level jobs. They became middle-class jobs later. So there are lots of things we can do. I'm just throwing out several things. So we've been here before. There are lots of things we can do. It's not exactly the same, but we can change this.
You should comment on your thoughts about jobs and with the fire trade for it. I feel like so many people nowadays say like you need so much more than culture is not enough. And I feel like your charts are showing your slide is showing that there's not even many jobs for people that get fire degrees. So what does that mean? Like, as far as people entering college and trying to figure out their education, there's not much opportunity because the only jobs coming in are people that aren't meant to make. They're just getting stuck down a low wage job.
So this is, I think, how can I say this? I think most of American politicians in the media have just lied to all y'all, like frankly. And I don't mean to be dour about it, but it's the right word. So, a couple things. One, yes, a bachelor's degree today is what a high school diploma was 30 years ago. Think of it like that. So, it is not going to be enough for your generation, just to be honest. It doesn't mean there aren't jobs being created. So there are lots of jobs for people with bachelor's degrees and higher, but you might really want to consider, what are you going to do after college to give yourself the skills that you could survive in a rapidly changing and uncertain economy? And so here's how I think about it. Still, the rates of unemployment for a couple steps. The rates of unemployment for college grads is much lower than non-college grads. And if you have an advanced degree, if you have a master's or higher, unemployment rates are much higher. I mean, much lower. So you're safer. The more education you get, you're safer, no question. Number two, though, what we know is more than half of college graduates in the last 4 years, about 53%, are in jobs for which they are overqualified for. That's the reality. And so people are frustrated. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, I did everything I was supposed to do. My family and all my teachers told me to go to school, go to college, and everything would be fine. All right, well, that's true, but the world has shifted. So one way to think about this is, and especially, and then I added the robots in, because like in that case, and, robots can be teaching our classes at some point as professors, so we got to watch, we got to be careful. I like to think about the economy in terms of a fundamental division. When you think of all the jobs in an economy, there are basically two kinds of jobs. There are jobs for those that are task definers. Think of a supervisor who sets out a set of tasks for a project, and those that are task executors. It's sort of like a pyramid. The task definers, those who get to set what you're going to do on the job, they're at the top of the pyramid. And the rest of us are task executors who fill up this part. So the challenge for you is to figure out, just to be blunt about it, I know it's depressing, how do you acquire the right kind of skills that you can become a task definer in whatever job it is you have. So maybe, it might be creating an app. Whoever created Uber is like, they're doing really well right? Everybody know what Uber is? They define that, right? That was a task definition. The drivers are executed. Think about it like that. So what are in terms of the future of our economy, what are the kind of skills you can get? What are the critical thinking skills that you can equip yourself with? That no matter what happens, no matter how many robots come or don't come, you're still in a position where you can have some kind of, hopefully, guaranteed employment, as well as a job that is not just you defining a task, but that's actually fulfilling in some way. Right? We spend most of our lives at work. And it's kind of crappy to know that the future of our economy is going to suck, and I'm going to hate what I'm doing. We can be imaginative and change that. But I can't sugarcoat it. When I look at the data, because I think that's what most people are doing, and no one's having a real conversation, especially when you get into policy debates in DC, there's no real conversation about what is the future, what is our country going to look like by 2030? Where are we going to get the jobs?
Although, again, just
Yeah.
a positive spin on this.
Thank you.
It is true that, as some of your own data shows, the awareness of this being a problem has increased among
the
more
the
elevated,
public.
from the public, and I would say even in some policy circles. I mean,
Yes.
from audiences who would not expect to be all that interested in income inequality.
Right.
They're talking about it now in the range statement.
Yeah.
That's something.
Here, I'll give you a more positive. So this is, it was a radical idea about 20 years ago, but I think in Switzerland they actually voted on this idea in a referendum last year. There's this idea called a basic guaranteed income. There are different names for it. And the idea is, look, if the government assures every citizen, say $30,000 a year. So basic guaranteed income. You do whatever you want with it. But every say, citizen of the country gets